Welcome, Mr. Ambassador Jawed Ludin. You were Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs of Afghanistan during Hamid Karzai presidency. And currently you are in Canada, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes. Yes.
Exactly. And then very welcome to this interview of the Center for Strategic Analysis of the Portuguese East Indies Company. First of all, I would like to pass the floor to Mr. Marcus, our security specialist, to have some starting questions on the Afghan issue. Please, Mr. Marcus.
So thank you, Ambassador, for being with us. We would like to begin, if you don't mind, with a brainstorm SWOT analysis of the Taliban's. We could start with the strengths, if you don't mind. So what would you appoint as their main strengths as an entity?
I would say that the Taliban have obviously been a group for well over 2 decades now, almost 3 decades. So there is a strong sense of identity that they have as an Islamist, highly ideological group. And you could consider that is a very, this ideological motivation is one of their strongest sort of assets. I would also say that they're a very low tech, low maintenance, low cost military apparatus. They've been able to carry out the conflict of the last 2 decades against the strongest military power in the world, and one really significant reason that they've been able to do that is because they're essentially very low cost and low maintenance, and at the same time lacking total in bureaucratic bureaucratic complexities. And finally, what I would say is that they have, because they come from they basically have, related to my first point about ideological motivation, and they are in a extremely poor part of the world, in Afghanistan, but also in the poor parts of Pakistan. And generally, I think in Pakistan, radicalization and Talibanization is slowly taking roots. It has been doing for the last 2 or 3 decades, in fact. One of the reasons for their success is that there is poverty, so they have an endless pool of recruits, people, young men who just don't have anything else to do. They don't have meaningful livelihoods, and they're alienated with their societies, with their governments, and with their own economic conditions. And that's why they turn to Taliban, because they have a simple message, a very, very simple message of ideological motivation. So these are some of the strengths that they have at the moment. However, we will obviously discuss it in this interview, but they also have very major weaknesses as well. And what we might do now that they have come back to power in Afghanistan is that now, the gear will be switched from strengths to weaknesses now. So we might be seeing more of the weaknesses coming up rather than the strengths now.
Thank you. Yes, actually, these are very good strengths. The pool of recruitment, the capacity of using the ideological part. So, in this weakness, as you highlight, very good, the type of tactics will be very different. They pass from a low cost, as you say, a strength tactics of almost guerrilla warfare to a more, we'd say, conventional capacity now to sustain the stability of the country. So can we explore a little bit more the weaknesses that you could point to them?
Yes, well, a major drawback that the Taliban have is that they have failed, despite the fact that they've existed now for almost 3 decades, they have failed to develop a political agenda. It has been primarily a military machine, and even during the time when they were in power in the 1990s, they did not manage to develop any sort of significant political agenda, create a political party, or even define political goals. Their objectives are very plain, very simple, and in fact, in the last 20 years, since I've been fighting with the US-led international coalition in Afghanistan, their messages have remained very simple. They don't have, and I would even say that the past 3 years, especially since they had a very active presence in Doha, and they were engaging with world powers, they were negotiating with the United States. It is quite amazing to see that they still have not managed to articulate political objectives. If you ask the Taliban leader, even some of the more intelligent ones, about what exactly do the Taliban want, you will not hear much other than just to say, well, we want an Islamic system. But then if you ask them to explain what that means, they would actually be unable to do that. So then what happens is that then by default, when they come to power, which they have done now, then they fall back on the easiest things that they know, some of their cultural practices, some of the most radical, simple practices, and that's how they will, they will continue that. I'm afraid, this has really been the most important weakness that they had. But I would also add to that the fact that they also, even though for fighting a guerrilla warfare, lack of bureaucracy is useful, because that means that you can maintain a very wide network of resistance throughout the country, very small scale, and that it's very difficult to remove that, to fight it, because even if you remove this one part, then that will not affect the other part, because there is no effective bureaucracy that's connecting the different components. But when you're in the government, that doesn't work. In the government, you have to have a very clear line of command. You have to have simple, some sort of a simple structure that is understandable to people. And you also have to have components that are doing other things other than just fighting a war and then messaging to people. You have to have a policy making division, and I think they don't. This lack of a bureaucratic structure and lack of a policy formulation division is another key weakness that they have. So what we see is that they know how to fight a war. They also are very good communicators, because the message is simple. Therefore, they just basically, it's been very easy to communicate. But when you come to power, when you're in the government, then the message is no longer simple. Then you have to address so many different constituencies and audiences at the same time. So unless you have clear policies, and policy is something that they don't have, and unless you have clear policies, you won't be able to really function. That's why I've always maintained that the Taliban will soon realize and I think they're beginning to realize now that winning this military victory may have been possible for them, but governing Afghanistan will not be possible the way they are, the way they're structured right now.
Thank you so much. I totally agree with that, and that leads to the opportunities, internal and external opportunities. Is there any opportunity that you could forecast that they could use, they can have to build some government or some possibility of governing the country?
Well, yes, of course the opportunity has been there. The fact that they won the military victory, and whatever what people feel about that, or I feel about that, anyone. It's kind of it's one matter, but they are now in power and they have won the war. This is something that we have been in the think tank that I am associated with, the Heart of Asia Society, from day one. We have emphasized that we should see if there is an opportunity in all of this. And in fact, the opportunity was there. There are some elements in the Taliban who realize that it has to be really, this victory has to be managed in a way that does not prolong the war in a different form, but it actually ends the war forever in Afghanistan, that it gives Afghanistan an opportunity to build a better government. Because let's remember, I mean, we all, me included, myself included, I'm associated with the former regime, the Republican regime. But I was completely disgusted by the leadership of the previous government that we just had. The disgraced president, the way he handled this. So I think it would be a mistake to see this as black and white, that everything previously is rejected and then they have to build everything from scratch. No, the Taliban could have, I think a better way would have been for Taliban to actually see that they could actually use a lot of those institutions that were built over the last 20 years, a lot of the infrastructure that's built, a lot of the capacity that's built is absolutely essential for Afghanistan. At the beginning, they gave some signals that that's what they were doing, and they have been, relatively lenient in terms of their behavior towards some elements. I'm afraid I have seen, as time has gone over the last month has gone by, we have seen that they are more unhelpful, more sort of intolerant behavior has come up in some areas. I know this is going to continue. It's not easy. Afghanistan is a big country, so there is still an opportunity. And despite some of these practices that we have seen, intolerance against political opponents, some intolerance against, the resistance that remains in Panjshir, for example, the behavior that we have seen against women already, the segregation that we have seen, the discrimination that's coming to, some evidence is coming through. Those are worrying signs. However, I still am one of those people who believe that we should still wait and see, because I think there may still be an opportunity. Maybe they are, the fact that they came to power in a very sort of quick and unexpected way, maybe they're a little bit, unprepared for all of this, and perhaps, in a few weeks' time, maybe sanity and good sense will prevail, and perhaps they will do the right thing. But it's quite hard to actually really be so optimistic about those things when you see that every day something comes up and that's negative. So while I still think there is opportunity, to go back to your question, I think every day that something positive does not happen and rather something negative happens, that opportunity is slipping away.
Thank you. So, and to go to the last point of SWOT analysis for now, the threats. After what we speak, it's almost like the strength of the Taliban in the beginning could be also the threats to the even Talibans, to a Taliban regime. But what can you foresee as other main threats to a Taliban regime, even inside and both outside the territory?
Well, you know, perhaps if we did a sort of a more, if we had more time, perhaps we would do a more elaborate SWOT analysis to do it, because it also depends on from whose perspective you see this. If it is from Taliban perspective, then it may be a little different. But what I have been telling you is really from a perspective of what I see perspective of Afghanistan. As a country, and in that to continue on that sort of strand, what I would see as the biggest threat is the threat of civil war, because if the exclusionary practices continue, I think if you know, it's very likely, and we also have a situation where the regional dimension of the Afghan conflict is still very relevant. Countries have you know, there is no consensus in the region about what Afghanistan should look like, and you know what's going on in Afghanistan. Some countries are rather excited about what's going on right now. They're happy. Some people are completely, utterly worried about what's going on in Afghanistan, and then there are others who are somewhere in between. So the reason I mentioned the regional dimension is because, you know, whether there will be a civil war in Afghanistan will also depend on whether the region will be prepared to go to war, whether they will continue to support their proxy groups, and then you know, or not. So that I see as the biggest challenge. But even if they do, even if if that does not happen, if the Taliban obtain full 100% control of territory and power in Afghanistan, it's not going to be easy. Afghanistan of today is not Afghanistan of the 90s. It's a very complex society right now, and it's and the Taliban are completely unprepared to deal with this. Even you know, even our previous governments who, you know, came through some sort of democratic exercise to power, and they were completely familiar with modern government practices, and they came from the, you know, from the, you know, from the process itself of democratic exercise. They were unprepared to deal with this. So let alone the Taliban will be really challenged to succeed. So that would be the other thing, is that they, it's, you know, especially now some of the specific threats we're seeing right now to stability, but also to the Taliban's ability to create some sort of you know, normal, a sense of normalcy in the country, is exactly these some of these factors. The fact that domestically there's a lot of pressure on them from media, from civil society, from women's groups, but also from active political resistance. But also externally, there is a lot of pressure on them from regional countries, but also primarily from the West. I think the fact that they still cannot pay, you know, there is no money in the banks in Afghanistan right now. So that's why you see hundreds and thousands of people just crowding outside bank offices, trying to get access to their own cash, and there is no cash. You know, that's a very real issue that the Taliban now have, and if this continues, it's going to have very deep destabilizing effect, because you can, you know, maybe they can control other things, but they cannot control economic, you know, hardship.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. This is my turn to ask you some other questions. Let's start for some a little bit more intimate questions on how Mr. Ambassador is from Pashtun ethnicity. Am I right?
I don't want to talk about that. It doesn't really
matter
where I come from.
Yes, exactly. But I'm going to explain. So how would you see this Afghan crisis? Because the majority, maybe the majority of the Taliban are Pashtuns, but like yourself, Mr. Ambassador, you are Pashtun and you are not Taliban. So the question is: this is a religious problem, is a organized crime problem, or is maybe not an ethnically driven problem? I would like to listen to your own perspective on these issues for once.
Well, this is a historic problem, and this is a geopolitical problem. That's as simple as that. It's not factors like ethnicity, like, you know, religious extremism, and you know, other things are actually used. They are, you know, they're manipulated as part of the process. But fundamentally, Afghanistan's challenge is not today. It is 40 years old. It's basically, it's the last conflict of the Cold War that hasn't ended yet. So whoever declared that the Cold War was over was wrong, because it still continues. It started with the Soviet invasion. The West supported an extremist Islamic resistance against Soviet invasion, because they thought that was the most effective way to fight communism. And then when the communists collapsed and the Soviet Union disintegrated, the West completely disengaged and left these elements to just basically continue there and to radicalize other people. And that's why Pakistan, Afghanistan, and in fact, in a lot of the Middle East, this whole problem festered. And then institutions like the Taliban, like Al-Qaeda, and later on ISIS, all these came from the same source. So that's why today I'm very skeptical about the fact that, well, number one, about people who see these, try to sort of overcomplicate things to say this is ISIS, and then there is Al-Qaeda, and then there is Taliban, there is, ETIM, and there is IMU, there is all these different things. But they're all part and parcel of the same thing. It's basically coming out of a policy to use extremist religious radicalization for political purposes. The West did it in the 1980s against Soviet Union, and then Pakistanis did it in the 1990s and in the past 2 decades. To try to basically give themselves a strategic edge over India in the regional conflict. So, and the Taliban is just basically one manifestation of that. In the last 20 years, it has been, this whole Taliban struggle has been sustained as a so-called liberation struggle to fight the so-called American occupation, as they called it. But it was really driven, fundamentally, it was driven by regional dynamics. It was Pakistan trying to keep that sort of strategic asset for itself in the future. So that's what it is. And inside Afghanistan, it's, as I said, it's always these other factors such as ethnicity, such as others, they're utilized, they're manipulated to fight it. But obviously, they all become important in their own right. Now, if there is no question that the majority of Taliban are Pashtuns, they come from that sort of Pashtun belt. There is the Afghanistan side of it, and then there is a very significant Taliban phenomenon in Pakistan, because there are more Pashtuns in Pakistan than there are in Afghanistan. So,
and Mr. Ambassador, sorry for interrupting. Therefore, maybe they are not acknowledging the Durand line. That's why.
Well, you see, I mentioned that it's geopolitical. Geopolitical, and the Durand line is one of the fundamental issues of the geopolitics of the region, because in addition to the problem that Pakistan has with India, Pakistan also has an historic problem with Afghanistan on the question of the Durand line. And that's what is one of the factors that drives Pakistani policy and Pakistan's support for Taliban. So you're right about that.
Mr. Ambassador, do you have a clue of how many or which different nationalities are engaged in these extremist movements already in Afghanistan, for example, just to have a notion, an idea?
Well, I believe it's it's hard to say specifically which, but one thing is clear, that over the last 20 years we've had the Taliban, other than the support they've received from Pakistan, they've also received significant support from sort of similar-minded Islamic groups from Central Asia, for example, various countries in Central Asia, from Eastern Turkestan and China, and then from Al-Qaeda, from ISIS later on. But with ISIS, the challenge was a little bit different, because most of the radical elements of Taliban, who were very radical, then later on they became basically Daesh or ISIS, and because ISIS was better resourced, I think they had more money coming from the Middle East. There have been some tensions between them. So I think I think it's not always the interaction between these various groups is not always very smooth. There are problems as well. There's no question. But the main point is to come to today. Today, it's I think there is no question that the Taliban's victory in Afghanistan will be seen as a as a good news and as a boosting factor for all Islamic groups in the whole region. We have already seen various entities welcoming this and celebrating this. Now, Taliban have a commitment that they have made to the United States and the agreement that they signed with them in Doha in February 2020, which says that Taliban will, detach themselves from Al-Qaeda and from other radical groups, and that they will fight with them and will not allow them to use Afghanistan to threaten other countries. But now, do the Taliban have that will, that interest, or that ability to do that, to deliver on that commitment, is something that I don't know.
Mr. Ambassador, can you see the Haqqani network as the intelligence arm of the platform, or as a platform intelligence arm of all of these extremist movements?
The Haqqani networks, the Haqqani network is partly a very effective operator in the midst of all these various actors, because of their very close links with Pakistan's intelligence service agency, the ISI. So that ability, the fact that they have direct access to the, perhaps to the, to the information and the, and the analysis that may, come from that relationship with the ISI, probably gives them significant advantage. But it is a very important part of the Taliban. It's not a very easy relationship as well, because Afghanis for a long time were very different than the Kandahari or the southern Taliban from Kandahar and Helmand, who were based, their leadership was based in Quetta, and the Afghani leadership was always based in Waziristan. So it was, so these are two distinct parts, and they were united, obviously, by, not only by Pakistan's support, but they were also united because of their enemy, and their enemy was the US and the West in Afghanistan. But we will see, and that's what we are seeing nowadays, that their differences will also now probably come up. And it probably will be not an easy relationship to manage.
Mr. Ambassador, as a diplomat, as a former foreign vice minister, former vice minister of foreign affairs of Afghanistan, how can you foresee the situation? First, how can you analyze the situation of the 17 members being blacklisted by United Nations? And then who will be representing Afghanistan in the next General Assembly of the United Nations?
Good question. Good question. I think my own understanding is that the sanctions list is going to be a tricky issue. I don't think anybody is going to be in a hurry to delist those Taliban leaders. And particularly what we have seen is in Russia, for example, as a permanent member of the Security Council, and without obviously support of all Security Council members, delisting will not take place. So Russia now seems to have a very sort of cautious approach to this. There was one point. I mean, Russia has always been very worried about delisting. They've not done it enthusiastically ever, but there was this one point in which they were willing and more open, because they saw their relationship with Taliban as an important element in their regional policy. But we are seeing increasingly signs that Russia is changing gear a little bit, and they will have a very strong sort of opposing voice, I presume, in the Security Council on the delisting issue. In terms of who will represent Afghanistan, I think there's an issue now, not only in the United Nations list, but across the world. We have close to 60 embassies around the world, and there's a huge sort of issue of uncertainty. The Taliban have been a little cautious on that front. It will really, they know, and everybody else knows, that it will really depend on this question of recognition. Now, so far, there is no single recognition that has come through to the Taliban government. But Taliban themselves have not made very clear announcements. They haven't. I mean, they announced the cabinet, but they also then said, "Oh, this is just a transition government, a temporary government. It's not really the government." And they, for example, replaced the name of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan with Islamic Emirates, but they haven't announced that officially. They just de facto use it. And all this is, I believe, that they're trying to sort of test the water a little bit before they move. So it will fundamentally depend on what the Taliban do. If they really seem to be inclusive, if they continue to respect and keep the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, and the same flag, the same name, then it will not be an issue, I think, because of the principle of continuity of state. The Taliban will be, de facto rulers of Afghanistan, and their government will, in all likelihood, be recognized. But sadly, if the Taliban go the other direction, which is that they, declare their own Islamic emirate of sort, then I think that will put a lot of people off from recognizing them. And if they are not recognized, then essentially Afghanistan, it's quite likely that Afghanistan's membership of the United Nations may be suspended of some sort. So you probably will not have a representative. Currently, some of the embassies are still active, but that's just simply because everybody's waiting to see what happens. And there is no other government also, that those embassies can represent right now as we speak.
So, in this sense, there's no clear chain of command on the foreign ministry, or we can say that some embassies are on the command chain of the president Abdullah Saleh, or caretaker president, whatever.
It seems like a lot of embassies do that still, because at least that's that still represents some continuity.
At least at the legitimate narrative.
They have a legitimate narrative, as you said. Even though I think the challenge is that when you do not even have an announcement was made by Mr. Abdullah Saleh, but since then we haven't heard anything about where that government is, where it's operating from, and also effectively, I think this will become a question of sustaining that, because if these embassies are not paid, if they don't get support from the capital, then they will not be able to function as well. The difference in there was a similar situation in the 90s as well. You may recall the Taliban were in power, but in the government at that time of Professor Rabbani, late Professor Rabbani, was actually the recognized legitimate government of Afghanistan, and it was his government that represented Afghanistan at the United Nations. But I think the difference of that time was that you had the president who was still there, and and then some governments continued to recognize Professor Rabbani's government. Today, the problem is that the president, you saw what happened. He rather disgracefully fled the country, and then also nobody has, so far expressed, no country has expressed any opinion whether on recognizing the Taliban or recognizing Abdullah Saleh's government as well. So we are in a bit of a limbo on this one.
Mr. Ambassador, you have worked with President Karzai, and how about the shortcoming of Karzai? Do you have any notion on that?
Well, what I would say is it's, obviously we could all, as Afghans, we could all have done things better. And we, sometimes I think the situation we have right now, which is a total failure of leadership, total failure of vision. But even though it's also a total failure of international engagement. So let's just make it very clear that at least half of the blame goes to to the way that the whole engagement was conducted from the United States and from its allies as well. But a major part of the blame, I always say, is an Afghan blame, and we should be prepared to take it. Now, to that extent, President Karzai, as the longest-serving president at one point, he served for 13 years, he will have some responsibility, and he has, in fact, admitted that some of the things could have been done differently, and some of the challenges could have been avoided. But the question remains that he is he is probably the most widely respected political leader in Afghanistan today. Even he is the most courageous. He is the cleanest. He is he's especially when these things, quality of leadership, quality of people become important, and especially when crises come up. In terms of crisis, he has chosen to stay in Afghanistan, not go anywhere, and try to play a role. And he was also, I think, despite his some of the other problems or some of the mistakes that may have been made, he was a factor of unity in a country that today, sadly, is suffering from a major crisis of unity right now. So it is a very valuable thing to have somebody like him.
Mr. Ambassador, and then how about the contract-based economy that the American have set in Afghanistan, and actually who benefited from it?
Well, it's that's a completely different sort of side to this whole to the war. American wars are very massive operations, and there are amazingly large amounts of money involved. Now, Afghanistan was a very small country, was an extremely impoverished country. There was, at the time when the US and NATO arrived, and so just for the country to be flooded suddenly with that kind of money, it was not prepared for it. So it benefited, obviously. I mean, Afghanistan, the difference we see in Afghanistan today, it's a much more different country. That's what I was saying to you, is thanks to that intervention. So we have to, a lot of times we just become too critical, and then we don't even acknowledge the good things about something. So the change has happened. Not just because Afghans have taken the opportunity and they've shown courage and have changed their own situation, but it also because help was available and money was available. But in terms of the contracting world, my own, from what I sort of understand it is a system that makes sure that the majority of the money goes back to the country where it comes from, in terms of salaries, in terms of very large procurement contracts that go back to those countries, which probably is fine. I mean, why should we have an argument and say, oh, why don't you give us all your money? Because it's their money, they spend it. But it would be good if they also recognize it sometimes, like their own President Biden. I'm quite disappointed about the fact that he either does not understand or just pretends that he doesn't, that this is a very complicated thing, in that it's not been 20 years of unlimited commitment that has not worked, or it has not been unlimited amount of money that poured in that has not worked. He should realize that the majority of the problem was, in fact, in his own capital, in Washington, that could have been done better. So some responsibility, all leadership, I think, across the board, all leaders should be humble enough to take some responsibility.
Mr. Ambassador, on President Karzai again, do you think that President Karzai was sort of lenient towards the Taliban, as President Karzai famously said in an interview when was asked, and then I quote, "What are you gonna do about the places Taliban took? And then President Karzai responded, so what, are the Taliban's not Afghans, for example?
Well, I mean, he has a bit of a trademark leniency generally. I think you will recognize that that he was. It's not just the Taliban that he was very accommodating towards. He has been known for his big tent policy. I'm not. I mean, I'm not here to speak for him or to defend him in any way. I'm not his spokesman anymore. That was a very long time ago when I was. But if you compare it to the completely schizophrenic policies of his successor, Ashraf Ghani, I think President Karzai's at least, he may not have been justified in a lot of those things, in saying what exactly you said, but he was consistent. So he didn't do something. He did not lie to himself. He did not lie to his people. He just said what he believed in. And I think part of the value of this exercise would be for one to go back in check. I think from day one when he came to power to today, 20 years later, he has been very consistent. That's the one thing. And I think whereas the trademark of the guy who replaced him was lies and inconsistency and deception. So I don't necessarily agree with that particular statement by President Karzai. And in fact, when I worked with him at the time, we used to have interesting arguments. One value that was there in working with him was that he was a very approachable man. He would listen to his colleagues a lot of times, and I really liked that. I really appreciated that opportunity, and we would have arguments. So I didn't, on this specific point, in fact, I remember having these arguments with him. However, I now completely respect the fact that he had that view and that he was consistent and that he didn't lie to his people and he didn't deceive his people.
Mr. Ambassador, on the defense side, do you think that was the Afghan army set to be defeated? That the Afghan army was sort of designed, if it was the American military, the troops move on ground and get air support, which was always provided by the Americans. Since by the departure and withdrawal of the Americans, of course, the whole operations or any operations would be jeopardized if you don't have air support, for example.
I think one thing that has to be made very clear is that the Afghan military, the Afghan army lost the war at the very top. It was the commander-in-chief that lost the war. I don't think it was the rank and file. I think Afghan security forces fought valiantly. And the evidence of that is the fact that until the last day, they gave unbelievable numbers of casualties, of lives that were sacrificed. So you can't really lose lives when you fight. It's only when you don't fight, when you actually run away from a fight, that you that you don't die. That's what the commander-in-chief disgracefully did at the end. So I think it has to be made very clear that the Afghan security forces lost the war at the very, very top, not the rank and file. The rank and file, it's the finest institution in Afghanistan. It would be a total tragedy if it is not, revived and continues. That if that becomes dismantled in any way now due to Taliban negligence or policy, But yeah, so I think it was not just the role of, I mean, they could have won the war without their support, but they only needed better leadership. The leadership was, I think the problem was not losing air support. The problem was that they did not have food to eat, because some of President Ghani's cronies stole money from their food contracts. And some of his cronies stole money from his ammunitions to go into. A lot of people fought to the last bullet, and they were killed, or they surrendered when they spent that last bullet as well. It was not that because they were waiting for the plane to come and bomb the Taliban. No, because they ran out of food and ran out of munitions. What do you do? And that was not their fault. That was the fault of the commander-in-chief.
So, Mr. Ambassador, what you have just explained just contradicts completely what was the narrative of the Biden president.
Completely. I mean, Biden is completely mistaken on this one. With due respect, I have known President Biden in the various positions. I've had, he's a long-term, politician. He was, from the time when he was senator and vice president, he used to come to Afghanistan a lot, and I respected him at the time. But I must say, I have actually lost a lot of that respect for him, due to what we have seen very recently. Not because he took the forces out. I mean, nobody really wanted seriously that the American troops will stay there forever. It's just that they should have done it in a responsible manner. That they and also that they should actually tell the truth, not just twist truth so it kind of fits their narrative. And so they have to really realize that. And also the other thing is what I just said about the fact that they lost. The war was lost because there was a failure of leadership at the very top level. I would also say that the gentleman who was the top commander of the American troops in Afghanistan until the last day, they should have also noticed that. I think they're complacent with this failure, because they knew that there was crisis. They knew what was going on. They knew that the forces did not have food to eat and ammunition, but they didn't say anything.
So Mr. Ambassador, do you think that there is any same pattern of doing or dealing with Afghanistan between the Clinton administration, of the Democrat Party, and of the Biden's Democrat Party? Because they are from same parties, Democrat parties. Clinton's when dealing with the Taliban, and now.
Sorry,
no problem.
My children.
No problem.
Is this a live broadcast?
No. We can manage this. No problem. But the point is, do you think that there is any close pattern of doing things, or modus operandi, between the Clinton administration when we're dealing with the Taliban, and now the Biden administration with the same people, maybe from the Clinton administration?
Well, I mean, I don't want to just comment on U.S. politics too much, because obviously that's a completely different issue. And also, in the Clinton's time, I don't think they dealt with the Taliban. The Taliban did not exist at the time. It was well, I mean, they did exist towards the end of that time, but
exactly until before the coming of Bush.
Yeah. Well, to the extent that I think that the similarity that you're probably alluding to is the fact that there was this sort of rather isolationist tendency in the Clinton administration as well, about the fact that, let's minimize our engagement in the world, and all we can do is we can resolve some of these issues by firing some cruise missiles, and but there was there was sort of total reluctance to get involved and actually do something about the threat that was. I think also to the extent that there was the Al-Qaeda threat at the time was brewing. It was developing in Afghanistan, but they ignored a lot of evidence at the time, and a sense of urgency was not there. So you may say that maybe it's a fundamental sort of democratic party agenda there, that's a completely different issue. What we are saying right now is, I think that a lot of Democrats are very unhappy with the way that Biden has managed this. I mean, to be fair, it was not something that Biden started. I think it was a Trump strategy, Trump decision. But then the whole reason that that Trump lost, his second bid to a second term, and that Biden was chosen, was that it would be a more responsible form of government. So that's what's more surprising. Nobody blames Biden for coming up with this, but I think everybody is surprised by how he has failed to really meet expectations of people about acting responsibly. I think it was an extremely responsible move to do that. To first of all, to actually fail to predict what would happen, and secondly, I mean, there were, just to see a superpower. I mean, somebody like myself from a very, very poor, small, impoverished country that has had huge amounts of engagement in two decades with the U.S. What I would say is that this has disappointed me very, very much.
Mr. Ambassador, in a glance, how can you define what is at stake with each of your neighboring countries in a fast glance? Starting from Pakistan, for example.
No, I think Pakistan is very important right now because they've obviously perhaps one of the most important relationships with the Taliban, and it's very important for Pakistan to realize that that if this does not work, if Afghanistan does not become stable, radical Islam is going to be a threat to themselves very much. So I think what's in stake with Pakistan is really they can stop this from developing into a civil war if they wanted to, and so they have to really act responsibly and also act in their own interest, because it's going to affect them as well. With I think with Central Asian neighbors,
Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan,
Tajikistan, with them, I think it's important that they have an engagement to see for themselves. One thing that would be wrong would be to have, the whole notion of strong borders and therefore try to protect ourselves from threat. I think it would be important to engage the Taliban and try to change them if they have to, because I think this Taliban is going to be unlike the 1990s, when they did not have experience of engagement with the outside world, only with a few countries, primarily Pakistan. This time Taliban are much more practiced now, and they have good relationship, I think, in some Central Asian countries as well. Iran has been really quiet since the Taliban took over. They have their own relationship with certain Taliban groups, and obviously with the there's been there was also a very strong relationship with the previous government that Iran had. So again, on that one as well, it's it's going to be a very tricky relationship between Taliban and Iran.
Mr. Ambassador, water, is it an issue with Iran? Water?
Yes, no, water was an ongoing. This is one of the things that we at the Heart of Asia Society are looking at, is the issue of the water, the riparian and sort of transboundary water diplomacy with Iran. It is an issue and will remain an issue, and I think, but I don't think they will have in the foreseeable future a sort of a partner in the Taliban to take that discussion forward.
And then the remaining countries, maybe in the second tier, Russia, but at the same time China and India.
Yes, those are regional and international powers, and China obviously has shown a lot of enthusiasm for engagement with the Taliban. But I think with them it would be very important that they actually use that to effect some change, some positive change in Afghanistan towards maybe a more inclusive approach to governance. And I don't see any evidence that they're doing that. And in fact, I know that some Chinese believe that it's a completely irrelevant issue. It's up to Afghans themselves. We will not just deal with that. Whoever is in Kabul, we will just, inclusive or not, as long as they can stabilize Afghanistan, then we will work with them. So for them, the major thing is stability. But I think they have to just see it in a bit of a broad sense. Stability, you can create an impression of stability now, but it's not going to become stable in the long run if it's not, if it's not inclusive. Russia will have a major role, and it will be very critical for Central Asian republics as well to see what Russia is doing. I think it's going to, it's actually going to be very hard for Russia to engage with Taliban when there is still an active resistance against them in the north of Afghanistan. So they will probably feel very much responsible to support that, which, I assume they do. And India, I think, is on India, it's an interesting situation because they've obviously are considered as the country that has lost out. India and Pakistan always see their relationship as a zero-sum game. So if one, the gain of one is the loss of the other, and so they have lost out. But I also see that they also want to remain engaged very much. So it would be important for Taliban to not completely give in to this temptation that maybe some Pakistanis want them to do, is to cut ties with India completely.
And what are the expectations on the European Union's member states or European Union itself?
Well, European Union is a major player. I think the Taliban are very, very keen to engage Europe in general and European Union in particular, because they know that at least some of them know very well that they will need economic support. They need, for example, the humanitarian support that was announced in Geneva the other day. But I also think Europe can do much more than it's doing already. I think it was not a good thing that all European and all Western embassies were closed in Kabul. That was a bad sign. I don't think the Taliban would have done anything to them. I think the Taliban, in all likelihood, would have probably done their best to protect them. Because once you lose contact, then that's where a lot of that very important leverage is lost in that. So they have to do more than they're doing right now, including in terms of pushing them towards a more responsible form of government. I'm against the policy of seeing it as a dichotomy between recognition or sanctions. Those are two extreme sort of black and white kind of policies. You either recognize the Taliban today or you sanction them because they don't allow women to work. I think there is a middle way. The middle way is that maybe you don't recognize them right away, right now, but you actually apply some positive, constructive conditionality in terms of engagement, and you also try to help them, push them on some of those commitments that they've made, and then offer aid as a reward, as an incentive. And I think it should work. That would be where Europe can lead, and I'm sure the United States can actually follow that as well.
For example, giving a percentage, what will be the importance or relevancy of the global community in not recognizing the Taliban currently? Is it a relevant issue? Is not? How will you see? Because you already talked a little bit about this issue.
I'm not sure I understood the question. Whether
if it is important for the global community not to recognize the Taliban, so in 1 to 100, what will be the percentage of importance of this issue?
Well, this is a very important issue, obviously, because it may not necessarily be in itself as recognizing, but I think it's, if you put it generally in terms of what do we do about Taliban, like some sort of a response to Taliban, it is one of the important issues that's there. It's perhaps in terms of time, because this is probably the number one issue, other than the humanitarian crisis right now, which everybody is concerned about, evacuations and also some of the harsh situation we're seeing in terms of the status of women. The next most important issue is the issue of recognition, long-term engagement. But I think that's not the problem. The problem is the fact that they see the whole recognition as unhelpful, as they either do it or they don't. There is a third way. What I'm arguing is that there is a third way to do it. That you don't recognize now, later, but you have to work with them to get there. And the other thing is that there is a difference between the Western part of the world and also regional. I think in the region there is already a movement to recognize the Taliban. I think Pakistan will probably do that rather soon, and others like China, like some Arab countries might follow. But I think Russia would probably take its time, as well India and others. But in the West, I think it probably will not happen under the current circumstances. But on the other hand, I think it's also very important that they don't, that they don't make it a situation where the Taliban will say, okay, we don't really care if you do it or not. I think it's important to keep a conversation going. Because at the end of the day, the Taliban mentality is such that, you cannot think of them as, okay, well, if we don't recognize them, then they will really feel sad. No, they will just say, well, okay, if you do it, that's fine. If you don't do it, that's also fine. And that would be the worst situation, because that means then you will have absolutely no leverage, no contact.
Well, to finalize this interview, there is one more question regarding of international terrorism. For instance, if in the current situation, it is already inspiring terrorist attacks or movements all around the world, and then many security agencies are sending alerts, international alerts of imminent attacks and high alert situations. So if Afghanistan is recognized with the Taliban regime, it could be a capital city in the world of the world terrorism, or will not?
Well, I hope not. As I explained earlier, there is a very, very serious concern that Taliban, because of their background, because of the who they are and their roots as an Islamist group in the region, they will not find it easy to distance themselves from certain radical groups who have global agendas, and also it may even be that and let alone to fight them. But on the other hand, if there is also a possibility that if the Taliban, some elements in the Taliban who do have the view that it has to just remain focused on Afghanistan, and that it has to sort of create an inclusive governance agenda and move away from this sort of militarist Islamic concept, then and also you engage with them, then perhaps maybe you can avoid that situation where Kabul will become the capital of a terrorist regime.
Mr. Ambassador, but as far as we know, even the own Taliban, they maybe don't have full control on all these different style of terrorist organizations in Afghanistan.
No, that's correct. Absolutely. So there is a big risk. I mean, what I'm basically, I think, saying is that that's the fact that the Taliban are back in power, and there is there is very little leverage left. That all the embassies, and Western embassies certainly, are closed now, and that the U.S. is rather powerless in terms of the ability to do anything. And let's remember that you cannot really do remote bombing. Remote bombing is the worst effective strategy in these things. They have to know this. So in this kind of situation, there is a big risk that the global jihad agenda will prosper, will grow. That's what we've been what we have been warning against. And I think that there is a real threat of that right now. Now, we are where we are. That's the problem. I don't think there is any benefit to now giving these analyses. The important thing is we are where we are. The Taliban are in power. Is there anything that we can do right now to at least prevent the worst form of that sort of consequence, where it becomes basically taken over by a terrorist regime? What can we do? And that's what I'm basically arguing, that let's see if we can wean away Taliban and make it inclusive, bring in other elements to see if we can, we can still work with them and engage. Please engage, because this engagement is going to be worse. It's going to completely drive them, even if there are some Taliban elements that are still not very sure about being part of the global jihad agenda. But if you turn your back on them, then they will be driven even more to that corner. So engage to the extent that you can and see if you can change them. If not, then I'm afraid there is that risk of what you're talking about is there.
So, Ambassador, to finalize, do you think that it's still urgent to help those that want to go out from Afghanistan, to help them to go out, or in any sense to give assistance to find a safe harbor?
Yes.
Of course, for those in life threat or danger.
Well, you said it yourself. So if people feel that their lives are in danger, then there is an international obligation. There's an international human rights obligation to give them protection. And and I think the Taliban even as well, because travel is a fundamental right. They should be able to travel and go to places where they get safer life and protection. So I think that would be even though some would say that means that there's a brain drain and a lot of people actually leave the country, and that's going to affect the country's future in a significant way. But that's secondly, I think the secondary. But the first obligation that everybody has is for personal protection and people's lives, and that has to be respected.
But on the other side, there is at the same time a sort of threat, or could be a threat, or any kind of infiltration of extremist movements in this route. So how do you think that we should tackle this sensible situation?
Well, I think it's quite unlikely that this opportunity. Nobody predicted it, that this will happen in this way. It was a very, very spontaneous sort of situation that came up. So I don't think any organized group like Al Qaeda, like anybody who wants to have presence in the West, would have for terrorist purposes, that they will have used this particular track to send their sleeper cells to the West. I personally don't think that that's the case, because a lot of those people are just very genuinely deserving people, who just cannot imagine living under the Taliban and remaining safe. A lot of them have worked. Thousands and thousands of them have actually worked for Western forces in Afghanistan over the years, and just are completely scared. And I personally know many, many hundreds of people who are in contact, and they really have legitimate reasons. Now,
and these people are considered as infidel for the Taliban.
Yeah, exactly. So they have reasons on the Taliban have reasons for being for being concerned about them, because they consider them, as you said, infidels, and they have reasons to be afraid for their own lives because of that. But I think the West, the other thing is, I mean, the West should have their own systems, I would say, of screening these people as well, just to be doubly sure. I mean, global migration is already happening, and this is only a small number, and when you put it in the context of the global movement of people to safer places. But I think in this case, the thing is, at least you know where they're coming from effectively from one source. You probably can, trace them back to their previous lives, and probably much easier than you would, for example, be able to do that when people arrive from boats, and from in the back of trucks on your streets. Because these people, you have, you basically kind of trace them back to where they come from.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador, for your time and such an excellent, in-depth vision on the crisis of Afghanistan. And then we hope to have you some other times as well. And of course, that we will do our effort to share our material with the Portuguese media as well. Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador Jawed Ludin.
Thank you very much. It was good to talk to you.
Yeah. Thanks a lot.
All the very best. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.